All right, this is Drama 203, Section 1, another video lecture. And today's video lecture is on Restoration theater. When I use the term restoration, I'm referring to the period in English history that begins in 1660 and ends roughly in 1700. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about some of the most important Restoration playwrights, as well as some of the most famous and legendary stage performers of this era, as well as the playing companies and the theaters themselves. But first, I want to say a few things about the political history. Picking the story up where I left off at the end of the last video lecture, when I was discussing the turmoil in England in the 1620s and the 1630s, leading up to the Civil War of the 1640s. So in 1642, civil war broke out between the supporters of Charles I, the King of England. His supporters were called the Royalists, and the supporters of the English Parliament were often called the Roundheads. In 1645, after several years of battles with neither side gaining a particular advantage, Parliament created what was called the New Model Army, an army comprised of soldiers from all over England, rather than just local armies, which is what the parliamentary side had been using up until that point. This is where a very important figure in English history emerges, Oliver Cromwell. He was a landowner, he was a member of Parliament elected in 1640, and he became the head of the New Model Army. He was a brilliant military strategist, incredibly ruthless. He believed in total war, and he soon won a number of important battles. In May 1646, Charles, who tried to ally himself with the Irish Catholics, with the Scottish Presbyterians, recognized he was beat. He handed himself over to a Scottish army that had invaded the north of England, and that army handed him over to Cromwell, so ending the First Civil War. A year and a half later, November 1647, Charles escaped his captivity, ended up on the Isle of Wight. He made a deal with moderate Scottish royalists to support him in taking back control of England. So the Second Civil War broke out. This war ended in August 1648, when Cromwell wiped out the Royalist army. In the months that followed, Charles and Cromwell negotiated, but Charles wouldn't surrender the episcopal hierarchy of the Church of England, the bishops which were so strongly opposed by the Puritan side. And remember, Parliament was dominated by Puritans. So it went back and forth for several months. Finally, Cromwell purged the House of Commons of those members who wanted to continue negotiations. And in January 1649, the remaining parliamentary leaders put Charles on trial. This group of parliament was called the Rump Parliament. So they put the king on trial, charging him with, in the words of the parliament, attempting to design an unlimited and tyrannical power to rule according to his will and to overthrow the rights and liberties of the people. The king was found guilty and executed on January 30th, 1649. It's estimated that 85,000 people died during the civil wars. The period between 1649 and 1660 is called the Interregnum. And during this period, England had abolished the monarchy and was a republic. Parliament ruled England, with Cromwell holding the title of Lord Protector. In the next few years, he brutally crushed rebellions in both Scotland and Ireland. Within England itself, there was trouble. The economy nearly collapsed after a series of bad harvests and outbreaks of the plague. Taxes soared. The army, which hadn't been paid, refused to demobilize. The Church of England virtually ceased to exist. Its leader, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the last one had been William Laud. He had been executed by Parliament about 2 years before Charles met that fate. Parliament outlawed sports, Sabbath activities, Christmas celebrations, and plays. Anyone caught acting in a play would be whipped. Anyone attending such a performance would be fined 5 shillings. The provost marshal, this was a new position that was created during the era of the Republic. The provost marshal was to imprison professional ballad singers and to shut down all plays. That was his job. Now, since 1642, the theaters themselves had been closed, but public performances of plays had been secretly held. So all of these measures by the Parliament, in addition to the fact that the Parliament increased taxes twofold, did not win increased support among the people of England. Cromwell, it's important to note, did pass limited but important legislation that allowed for religious toleration in England. This was the first time any such legislation was made law. And this prompted the explosion of religious sects in the nation. In September 1658, Cromwell died of influenza, and his son Richard was named Lord Protector. The younger Cromwell was incompetent. He was a total incompetent. And the senior officers in the army soon forced him to abdicate. After Parliament then tried to disband the army, England found itself on the verge of collapsing into total anarchy. In 1660, General George Monk was the head of the English army in Scotland. He was one of the best military leaders, and he had one of the most disciplined military forces. Well, he'd been in talks with the moderate parliamentarians who'd been expelled by Cromwell back in 1648. And with their consent, he moved his forces into England. In February, Monk ordered the members of Parliament who'd been expelled all those years before to be invited back, to return to their places in the Commons. And when the augmented House met, it voted to dissolve itself. New elections for Parliament were held in March, and the Republicans were defeated. The new Parliament invited back Charles II, the oldest son and heir to Charles I. This younger Charles had been living in France since 1642. He'd spent 18 years in France along with his mother, his sister, and his brother, hoping that the tide would turn and somehow the monarchy would be restored. And that's exactly what happened in 1660. In March of 1660, he promised a general pardon. On May 25th, he returned to England. And 4 days later, on his 30th birthday, he reached London, which was the site of great celebrations. As king, Charles soon resurrected universal censorship and reestablished a rigid episcopal hierarchy in church government. Nonconformist Protestants and Catholics were, after this point, largely excluded from public life. The body of Cromwell was dug up and hanged. So ending this period of the Republic. The Puritans had attempted to create a utopia, and they'd failed. Although it should be pointed out that England in 2020 more closely resembles the vision of the parliamentarians than it does that of King Charles, either King Charles I or King Charles II. It's absolutely one of the most fascinating periods in all of English history. And I could do a whole lecture just on the events of the 1640s and 1650s. But I have to move on. I want to get to this period called the Restoration. The major figure of this period is the king, King Charles II, Charles Stuart. Charles was handsome, extravagant, cheerful, hedonistic. He was a womanizer. He had 17 illegitimate children. He broke promises, and he was self-contradictory. At the same time, he was a compromiser. He knew when to back down. Shortly after assuming the crown, he married a Portuguese princess who became Queen Catherine of England. They failed to have any children who survived into adolescence, which caused problems down the line as Charles became older and the English people began to wonder who will be our next king. Well, England was still officially Protestant, and the Anglican Church was once again the state church. But Charles had a brother, a sister, a mother, and a wife who were all Catholic. Charles's own religious views were constantly speculated upon by the English public. Right? Here was this man, in a sense, the head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. At the same time, he spent 18 years in France. The members of his family were Catholic. And at this point in English history, a great bias had formed against Catholics, right? Catholics are often seen as the enemy. And so this too would become a major factor in the later years of Charles's reign. But let's turn to the theaters. Charles, we don't know precisely what his religious views were, but we do know he was a great lover of theater. When Charles went into exile, he'd been joined by a playwright named Thomas Killigrew. Killigrew lived between 1612 and 1683. In August 1660, just a couple months after Charles had been restored to the throne, he gave Killigrew a royal patent to produce plays. He gave another patent to the playwright and theatrical entrepreneur William Davenant. Davenant lived between 1606 and 1668. So under Charles's regime in England, Killigrew and Davenant were the only two people allowed to produce plays. Killigrew ran the King's Company, which performed initially at a converted tennis court that Killigrew renamed the Clark Theatre. In 1663, Killigrew built the Theatre Royal at Drury Lane. It's a theatre that remains in operation today. Davenant, meanwhile, led the Duke's Company. The Duke's Company was called such because it was patronized by Charles's brother, James, the Duke of York. The Duke's Company performed at the Lincoln Inn Theatre, which was also a converted tennis court. Davenant died in 1668, and his successor was the actor and theatrical manager Thomas Bitterton. Bitterton oversaw the building of the Dorset Garden Theatre in 1671, which would be used not only for plays, but also for opera. The Duke's Company, now led by Bitterton, had exclusive rights to stage Shakespeare's major plays. And Bitterton became the leading actor of the Restoration, in part because of his success performing the roles of the great Shakespearean protagonists, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear. The King's Company and the Duke's Company were great rivals throughout the 1660s and the 1670s. Get to the beginning of the 1680s, and the Duke's Company had eclipsed the King's Company in popularity. The King's Company began to suffer great financial woes and was almost going to go under. And then the two companies decided to merge. They merged to form the United Company, performing primarily at the Drury Lane Theatre, the Theatre Royal. The Dorset Garden Theatre, in the meantime, was mainly used for operas as well as for court spectacles when there were visiting dignitaries from other nations. So the United Company performed plays at Drury Lane for just over 10 years. And in 1694, Bitterton had a falling out with his partners. And he broke off from the United Company and he reopened the Lincoln's Inn Theatre, the theatre that they'd used at the beginning of the Restoration. And Bitterton and his colleagues had great success at Lincoln's Inn. So these companies performed in artificially lit, rectangular indoor theaters, each of which accommodated 500 to 800 playgoers. So these are much smaller theaters than the outdoor theaters that were used in Shakespeare's day: the Globe, the Theatre, the Rose, the Curtain, the Swan. all of which could accommodate 2,500 to 3,000 spectators in a given performance. Well, each of the restoration theaters had 3 galleries. The bottom gallery was divided into boxes, boxes that were typically used by the nobility and the wealthy gentry. The top gallery consisted of benches. The main floor of the auditorium was called the pit. Here, spectators sat on benches in a semicircular arrangement facing the stage. We have an account from a French diplomat who visited London in 1698. His name was Henry Michon. And he wrote about what it was like to go to the Drury Lane Theatre on his visit to England. And he spoke specifically about the pit. He writes, "In the pit, men of quality, the younger sort, some ladies of reputation and virtue, and an abundance of damsels that haunt for prey, sit all together in this place, higgledy-piggledy, chatter, toy, play, hear not." So the playgoers in the pit were notoriously rowdy. They would cheer and jeer during a performance, and even interrupt plays by addressing the actors. Well, the Restoration theaters catered more exclusively to the upper classes of society than the theaters had in Shakespeare's day. Playgoers displayed the latest fashions. Women often wore masks called vizards to disguise their identities. It was more of a fashion statement than anything else. Now, it's also important to note that there was always a significant middle class element at the plays. These playgoers sat in the upper galleries. The Drury Lane, Lincoln's Inn, and Dorset theaters had, like the theaters of Shakespeare's time, thrust stages. The thrust stages at the Restoration theaters were about 20 feet deep. Actors could enter through 2 pairs of doors with balconies above them. The balcony then was no longer above the center of the stage, as it had been in the 16th century and 17th century playhouses. The balconies, there were 2 balconies, one on each side of the stage, just above the pairs of stage doors. Unlike the theaters of Shakespeare's time, Restoration theaters also had a proscenium arch. A proscenium arch which separated the acting area from an upstage area. And I think we all know what the proscenium arch is. Proscenium arch is an arch over the front of the stage. Audiences facing the stage in a proscenium arch theater observe the action of the play as if through a picture frame. So the Restoration combined the old with the new, the thrust stage from Shakespeare's day with the proscenium arch, which we associate with modern theaters. The upstage area behind the proscenium arch had a wing and shutter system. The wing and shutter system was used to represent scenic locations. The scenery was painted on pairs of shutters. The shutters were placed in parallel grooves on and above the stage floor, running along a track system cut into the floor. And so they operated much like sliding doors. One backdrop could be slid into the wings of the stage, exposing the backdrop behind it. So the proscenium arch and the wing and shutter system were adapted from 17th century French and Spanish theaters. Remember, Killigrew had spent 18 years in France, during the time of the English Republic. And so he came back to England with new design ideas about how to present these plays, how to set up the stage. And of course, Charles, who had also spent 18 years in France, going to many, many plays, he was a great lover of plays, was very receptive to adapting the continental approach to theatrical design once the theaters were reopened in England. Andrew Gurr, one of my favorite scholars of Shakespeare's time, has pointed out that in the late 16th, early 17th century theaters, the appearance of the stage was everything and nothing depending on what the play required. I'll quote that again. The appearance of the stage was everything and nothing, depending on what the play required. There's a difference in the Restoration. In the Restoration, dramatists could now rely on sets rather than dramatic language to suggest location. Restoration theatre, as I've mentioned, was based in London. By now, the population of London was over 500,000. London was a bustling center of politics, culture, and international commerce. In this period, the public met at coffee houses, concert halls, pleasure gardens, lending libraries, shopping districts, and of course, the theaters. In the first few years of the Restoration, revivals of the works of Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and other early modern playwrights made up most of the repertoire of the theaters. But within a few years, new playwrights and new styles had emerged. And that's what I want to do in the next part of this lecture, look at some of these key playwrights. In fact, 3 of these playwrights, starting with John Dryden. Today, John Dryden is better known as a poet, but he was also a very successful playwright for over 20 years. He was born in 1651 in Northamptonshire, and he studied at Cambridge University. He became well versed in ancient Greco-Roman literature and culture. He was very much a humanist. In 1664, Dryden began writing plays, and he soon became the chief playwright for the King's Company. He specialized in what is called heroic tragedy, and Dryden defined this genre. Dryden left behind not only plays and poems, but a number of lengthy critical essays on the craft of writing, and shared his neoclassical influenced literary theories with his readers. Well, this is what Dryden wrote of the heroic tragedy. He said, "A heroic play ought to be an imitation in little of a heroic poem," meaning an epic poem. And consequently, love and valor ought to be the subject of it. So that's one of the characteristics of the heroic tragedy. Another defining characteristic of the heroic tragedy is the style of verse that was used in the plays. Whereas Shakespeare and most of his contemporary playwrights wrote in blank verse, that is, on-rhymed lines of iambic pentameter. I've discussed blank verse in previous lectures. A pentameter line is a 10-syllable line consisting of 5 iambs. An iamb is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. And when you have unrhymed iambic pentameter, you have what is called blank verse. This is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the son of York. 2 lines of perfect iambic pentameter. This was the verse style that was used in the early modern period. Well, blank verse gave way to a large degree to heroic couplets, 10-syllable lines that rhyme in pairs. This was another one of Dryden's specialties. All the characters in heroic tragedy speak in an elevated and elaborate style. They all speak using heroic couplets. The heroic tragedies of Dryden and his contemporaries follow the rules of neoclassicism. So there are no clown characters in Dryden's tragedies. I discussed last time the neoclassical insistence against the mixing of genres, which had made Shakespeare's plays in many respects as exceptional as they are. The fact that he'd have a tragedy and he would incorporate elements of comedy, of satire, and so on, as we saw in Twelfth Night, a romantic comedy that's also a satiric comedy with tragic elements. Well, in the Restoration, and particularly in the works of Dryden, his heroic tragedies, there was none of this, because Dryden was through and through an adherent to neoclassicism, which rejected the mixing of genres. In 1670, he composed the first part of one of his most famous heroic tragedies, The Conquest of Grenada. In 1671, he wrote and helped produce the second part of this series of plays. It's about a battle between the Moors and the Spanish in 1492. The main character is Almanzor. He is this brave, valorous, honorable soldier who is a Moor fighting for the Moorish side. He falls in love with Almahady, who is betrothed to the king of the Moors, Badalin. The play tells this grand story of love, honor, friendship, jealousy, revenge, a story that's told against the backdrop of a war between civilizations. The great theme of The Conquest of Granada, parts 1 and 2, is the great theme of all of Dryden's heroic tragedies. That is the conflict between love and duty. Dryden was very much a royalist, and in his plays, as well as his poems, he promoted royalist values. In 1678, he wrote perhaps his most famous play, All for Love, which is an adaptation of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. And this adaptation demonstrates Dryden's desire for tight plot structures as well as moral clarity, neither of which is found in Shakespeare's original. If you really want to understand the major differences of how the writers of the early modern period handled tragedy compared to how the writers of the Restoration handled tragedy, an easy way to do so, and a very clarifying way, is to look at Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra and then Dryden's adaptation, All for Love. One is this sprawling story that mixes the genres and contains a great deal of moral ambiguity. I don't know if there's any more morally ambiguous characters than Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, the title characters. Dryden's play takes out the ambiguity and tightens the plot. Some have said it turns it into a drawing room play, and that may be going too far, but he certainly concentrates the action. I think both plays, I prefer Shakespeare's play, but I have in fact read All for Love a number of times and do enjoy it and see, the skill with which Dryden not only crafts, the overall structure, but those heroic couplets that the characters speak in. Well, Charles II was a major fan of Dryden's plays and poems. The king eventually made Dryden Poet Laureate of England. Dryden's plays were immensely popular at the Drury Lane Theatre during the Restoration. They haven't been performed very often since. The plays of Dryden's contemporary William Wycherley, on the other hand, enjoyed a major resurgence in the 20th century and continue to be popular in the 21st century. And so that's the next playwright of the Restoration that I want to discuss, William Wycherley. He was born in 1640 in Shrewsbury. He was the son of a steward and an attendant at the estate of the Marquis of Winchester. At age 15, William was sent to France to be educated, and he received an education at the school he attended, but he received a supplementary education when he went to the plays in Paris. He attended performances of Molaire's comedies, and these works would have a deep impact on his own writing. After spending time at Oxford University and at the Inns of Court, where lawyers trained, Wycherley served in the British Navy. Finally, in 1671, he began writing plays for the King's Company. Wycherley's type of comedy is called the comedy of manners. Comedy that deals with the relations and intrigues of men and women living in a sophisticated upper-class society. Comedies of manners rely for comic effect in large part on the wit of the dialogue, often in the form of repartee, and on the violation of social conventions. The Restoration comedies by Wycherley and other playwrights at this time feature various recurring stock characters, one of which is the fop. And we have already met a fop in this class. and that is Sir Andrew Aguecheek in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Well, he was sort of very much a secondary character in Twelfth Night. The fop as a character type becomes very prominent in Restoration comedy. And again, the fop is a buffoonish man with affected manners who is devoted to fashion. You know, we would maybe call him today a poser or a dandy. So there's the character of the fop that becomes very popular in Restoration comedy. There's another character type, the rake. R-A-K-E, the rake, the charming, devious womanizer. Well, in Wycherley's most celebrated play, The Country Wife, which was first staged in 1675, the rake character is Horner. Horner, who loves playgoing. At the beginning of the play, he enlists a doctor named Quack to spread a rumor that he, Horner, is impotent. This will make it easier for Horner to have affairs with the married women of London without raising the suspicions of their husbands. So that's what the main plot of this play turns on. This rake who comes up with this devious plan to get close to married women so he can continue to carry out adulterous affairs. One of the married women with whom he has an affair is Lady Fidget, the wife of a rich businessman, Sir Jasper Fidget. And then there's a subplot in The Country Wife. The subplot involves a middle-aged gentleman named Jack Pinchwife, who lives in the country and is visiting London to attend his sister's wedding. Pinchwife is obsessed with the possibility of becoming a cuckold, the fear that his young wife, Marjorie, the title character, will cheat on him. And in fact, in spite of all of Pinchwife's efforts, and after many twists and turns in the plot, Homer and Marjorie end up having a fling. The Country Wife is filled with sexual intrigue and with double entendre. Double entendre, a word or expression with two meanings, one of which is indelicate or improper. Comes from the French word for double meaning. The title of this play itself is a double entendre, and I'll let you figure out how that is so. The play could be called, and has been called, a sex comedy. At the end of The Country Wife, the two true lovers in the story, Harcourt and Alethea, finally come together after a number of obstacles. But Horner gets away with his con. And the figure representing traditional values, Pinchwife, ends up the butt of the joke. So look at this play, The Country Wife, and you can see that the sexual frankness in it, and the sexual frankness of all Restoration comedy, was very much a reaction against the nearly 20 years of Puritan rule. To understand why Restoration comedy is the way it is, you have to understand what happened from the 1640s through the 1650s. The fact that the Puritan-controlled Parliament ruled the nation instead of the king. So we come to the 1660s, and there's this reaction, right? There's a reaction. They may arguably overdo it in being anti-puritanical, because could there be a character who is less of a Puritan than this rake character, Horner, who is faking impotence so he can have more adulterous affairs? The Country Wife is the most frequently revived Restoration comedy. In fact, one of my favorite films from the 1970s, some of you may have seen it, Shampoo. It was a film written by Robert Towne, directed by Hal Ashby. It stars Warren Beatty and Goldie Hawn. It's Carrie Fisher's first appearance in a movie and was released in 1975. It's actually a modernization of The Country Wife. It sets the story in 1960s Los Angeles. Well, Wycherley wrote three other great Restoration comedies of manners. Love in a Wood from 1671, The Gentleman Dancing Master from 1672, and The Plain Dealer from 1676. The Plain Dealer is probably the second most commonly staged Restoration comedy in the 21st century. It was a very short career, consisted of 4 major plays, after the plain dealer, Wycherley had various health problems and he had financial problems, and the last few decades of his life is a very sad story. In that time period, 7, 8 years writing for the stage, he established himself as one of the masters of the comedy of manners and one of the great satiric writers in the history of the English stage. Well, the final Restoration playwright I want to discuss is Aphra Behn. Aphra Behn, the first woman to make a living as a playwright. Germaine Greer has written the following of Behn. Greer wrote, "She is not so much a woman to be unmasked as an unending combination of masks." It's believed that Aphra Behn was born in Herbaltown in the province of Kent in 1640 as Ephry Johnson. Her mother was possibly a wet nurse, her father a low-level government bureaucrat. Early in her life, her family moved to the British colony of Suriname, which is in South America. And at some point, after a return to England, she married a London merchant of Dutch extraction named John Behn. John Behn apparently died in 1665. In 1666, she served as a spy for the English government, codenamed Astrea. She was sent on a mission to Antwerp in present-day Belgium, and at the time England was at war with the Dutch over trade routes. She returned to London, and she turns up again in the historical record in 1668. At this point, she's working as a scribe, employed by Thomas Killigrew, remember, the head of the King's Company. Killigrew soon had her adapting old plays. In 1670, she moved over to the Duke's Company. The Duke's Company staged her first play, The Forced Marriage, in September 1670 at the Lincoln's Inn Playhouse. It's at this point, for certain, that she begins using the name Aphra Behn. The Forced Marriage was a tragicomedy, but Behn soon turned to writing sexually charged comedies of manners. In 1677, she wrote her most popular play, The Rover, which is a loose adaptation of Thomasia, which was an unproduced drama by Killigrew. The Rover is set in the 1650s in Naples, Italy, during the time of the Carnival. The main characters are two sisters, Florinda and Helena. If you go back to Killigrew's original story, yes, it's set in Italy, but there's one female character who isn't the lead character. When Behn adapted this story and turned it into The Rover, she pushed the female character to the foreground and gave her a sister, and they become the co-protagonists of Behn's The Rover. So she made many alterations, I think all of them which were very much called for and successful in adapting this story. Well, as the play begins, we have these two sisters, Florinda and Helena. Florinda is scheduled to soon enter an arranged marriage that she doesn't want to a much older man. Helena is scheduled to enter the convent. The sisters decide to disguise themselves and go to the carnival, where they meet four cavaliers, former soldiers who had fought for Charles I during the Civil Wars. A courtesan named Angelica Bianca becomes involved in their story, and there's disguise, there's intrigue, and it all ends with the two sisters finding love. It was her most popular play of the 17th century, and it continues to be Behn's most popular play. But Behn wrote other plays, other highly successful plays, including a set of comedies set in London. Sir Patient Fancy from 1678, The Roundheads, 1681, and The City Heiress from 1682, all staged by the Duke's Company at Dorset Garden. Mary Ann O'Donnell, who is a biography of Aphra Behn, has written the following. She said of these plays, they explore the recurrent themes of forced marriage between a beautiful woman and an older man, revealing the hypocrisy of the puritanical bourgeois merchant class. That's the storyline that Ben goes back to again and again. She started with her very first play, The Forced Marriage, an arranged marriage that the female protagonist doesn't want. Ben explored issues such as a woman's right to self-determination, the tyranny of the patriarchy, and the use of masquerade and carnival to renormalize the world. These are the words of Marianne O'Donnell. Ben also wrote a great deal about politics. She was a staunch supporter of King Charles and Charles's brother James. The male heroes in her plays are typically royalists. Ben got in trouble in 1682 when she took satirical aim at the leaders of Charles' parliamentary opposition. They were called the Whig Party. It's in the Restoration period that political parties in England began to take shape. There were the Tories that became the modern day Conservative Party. They supported Charles's initiatives in Parliament. And there was the Whig Party, which was city-based, dominated by the newly rich merchant class, the upper middle class, and they had many squabbles with Charles and with the Tories. In 1679, they attempted to exclude James, the Catholic brother of Charles, from inheriting the throne. Because remember, Charles had no heirs of his own. Tragically, the children that he had with his wife were all stillborn. And it caused this great controversy at the end of the 1670s. It was called the Exclusion Crisis. And Aphra Behn made her voice known. And as she did throughout her career, she came out on the side of the Stuart monarchy. Well, this time, in 1682, an arrest warrant was made against her, but it was never executed. So you have this complex figure, Aphra Behn. She was a combination of a progressive in her championing of women in the public sphere and a conservative in her defense of the Stuart monarchy. Well, after 1682, Aphra focused on writing fiction for several years. Her short novel, Urarokno, which was published in 1688, is about a slave rebellion in Suriname. It's a short piece of fiction, a short novel that's still read today and widely anthologized. In the final years of her life, Aphra wrote several more plays, including The Lucky Chance, 1687, and The Widow Ranter, her last play from 1688, which is about Englishmen living in the Virginia colony. In all, Aphra Behn wrote 18 plays. She was the most prolific playwright of the Restoration. She died in 1689 after several years of illness and financial problems. Well, turning then to the performers in the Restoration. Already talked about one of them, Thomas Bitterton, who became so well known through his performances of Shakespeare, playing the leads in the Shakespearean tragedies as they were adapted to the Restoration stage. Well, when the English theatre restarted in August 1660, women's roles were once again played by male actors. But then, in December 1660, an anonymous woman, perhaps Anne Marshall, played Desdemona in a production of Shakespeare's Othello, becoming the first female actor to perform on the English public stage. On April 25th, 1662, King Charles issued the following decree. These are the words of Charles. We do permit and give leave that all the women's parts to be acted either in either of the said two companies, the Duke's Company, the King's Company, for the time to come may be performed by women, so long as their recreations may be esteemed not only harmless delight, but useful and instructive representations of human life, to such of our good subjects as shall resort to the same. So he makes the argument for women playing the women roles in plays on the grounds of it is verisimilitude, it is true to life, and also it will give instruction to the playgoers to live virtuous lives. Well, it's thought that Charles made this decision because of the example of French theater. He spent 18 years, right from the time he was a teenager into his 20s, living in France and attending the French theater. And in the French theater, women had performed on stage since at least 1609. Well, the new female actors of the Restoration Theater were an instant hit, and soon the practice of boy actors came to an end. Here's another movie recommendation, Stage Beauty, where Claire Danes plays one of the early, it's a fictitious story with a lot of realistic historical context around it. And Claire Danes plays one of the earliest female actors. Billy Crudup plays one of the last boy actors who has matured into the adult roles. An excellent, excellent movie. Thomas Bitterton is even portrayed in the movie as one of the lead characters. Well, all this, the introduction of female actors to the Restoration stage, led to the emergence of what was called the breeches roles. The breeches roles, where female characters in the plays dressed as men, thereby revealing their legs. Which were usually when the female actors played female characters, their legs were usually covered by skirts, but their legs were now exposed in tight-fitting knee-length pants. And that caused great scandal, and it also brought about great box office success. Fiona Ritchie, who is a scholar of Restoration theater, writes the following: "One kind of cross-dressing, male to female, in order to play women's parts on stage, was to some degree replaced by another form of cross-dressing, female to male, in the breeches roles." Anne Russell is another scholar of Restoration theater. She's tracked the response in the larger English culture to the introduction of female actors in the Restoration stage. And she writes that the actresses were soon blamed for introducing immorality to the theater. The critics of the theater, and in every generation there are always critics of the theater, who usually attack the theater from a moralist perspective, they frequently compared the female actors to prostitutes. Moreover, while some of these actresses became celebrities in London, most did not have high salaries and did not become sharers in the company as the male actors did. It's a fascinating study by Anne Russell. Well, I want to turn now to two of those great female actors who enjoyed immense popularity in Restoration England. The first of whom is Nell Gwyn. She was the most popular female actor of the early Restoration. She was born, it's thought, in 1650 and grew up in the slums of London. Her father, who had been a royalist military officer, died when she was very young, and she was raised by her mother, who is said to have run a brothel. Nell, in her mid-teens, was working as a fruit seller in London, and she somehow caught the eye of Killigrew. And Killigrew recruited her to perform with the King's Company. She made her stage debut in December 1665 and soon became the company's leading comedic actress. Her first big hit was a comedy written by the playwright James Howard, and it was titled All Mistaken, or The Mad Couple. And it's about two witty, bickering lovers. Her co-star was an actor named Charles Hart. Charles Hart had started as a boy actor way back in the early part of the 17th century, working at the Globe Theatre with the King's Men. And then he graduated to the adult roles just when the theaters were shut down in 1642. But with the Restoration, a much older Hart, a middle-aged Hart, returned to the stage, and he had several glorious years, often working with Nell Gwyn. And they really started a trend for, it's kind of the screwball comedies of their day. They started a trend in early Restoration theater of the bickering, witty couple who finally come together and end. The male is a rake who is reluctant to marry. I mean, it ultimately derives from Shakespeare's play Much Ado About Nothing. But when it's revisited by James Howard, it leads to a succession of plays that use this scenario. Well, Nell Gwyn was known for her beauty, her charisma, and her wit. She sang and danced, and she often spoke the prologues and epilogues of plays. She was a master comedienne, but she also played tragic roles. She was the co-lead in the series of plays that I discussed earlier that John Dryden had wrote, The Conquest of Granada, parts 1 and 2. She was the co-lead along with Charles Hart. In 1669, she began an affair with the avid playgoer King Charles II. In 1671, she retired from the stage and moved into a townhouse that was owned by the crown, where she lived for the rest of her life. In fact, she was the mother of 2 of King Charles's children. The oldest child, Charles Beauclerk, was actually elevated to the title of Earl of Burford. The younger son, James, died at the age of 10. Nell outlived Charles by 2 years, dying in 1687 at the age of 37. So she became this celebrity, and more so, almost this folk hero in England during the Restoration. In recent years, in the 21st century, she's been the subject of a hit play, Jessica Swale's play, Nell Gwyn, that was first performed about 8 years ago in the West End in London. It was a big hit, received many awards, and then made it to Broadway and traveled on the road, did a tour throughout North America. This very fascinating figure from the Restoration, Nell Gwyn. Well, the last female actor I want to discuss is Elizabeth Barry. Elizabeth was born in 1658. She was the daughter of a royalist colonel, Robert Barry, who lost his wealth in the aftermath of the Civil War. She's first listed as a member of the Duke's Company in 1674 when she was 17 years old. Barry played both tragic and comic roles. In fact, she played Helena in the original production of Aphra Behn's The Rover. She took on roles in a number of other of Behn's plays based on some of the prologues that Elizabeth Barry wrote later in her career. It seems she was very close friends with Aphra Behn. One of her first major roles was as Cordelia, acting opposite Thomas Bitterton in a 1681 production of King Lear. She also played Lady Macbeth opposite Bitterton, as well as Cleopatra in Dryden's All for Love. From 1682 to 1695, she was a major part of the United Company. Remember, the Duke's Company, the King's Company had come together for just over a decade. In fact, she was so popular and such a box office success, she became the first stage actor to negotiate an annual benefit night for herself. She had it written into her contract, where she would get the night's net profits. Once a year, they would have Elizabeth Barry Night, and it was apparently a big hit. She was the sole lead performer in a number of popular tragic plays, most of which were written by the playwright Thomas Otway in the 1680s. He wrote the plays, created the characters with Elizabeth Barry in mind. They were given the name She Tragedies. In 1694, she left the United Company to become a shareholder and the co-manager with Bitterton of the new Lincoln's Inn Company. Elizabeth Barry never married, but she did have a 5-year relationship with one of the most well-known literary figures of the Restoration, John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester, the author of many famous, infamous satiric poems. A Satire Against Mankind is his most famous poem. Barry was still a lead player at the turn of the century and into the first decade of the 1700s. She performed as Cleopatra again in a very celebrated 1704 revival of All for Love. She retired at age 52 in 1710. The contemporary, the Restoration poet, a contemporary of Barry and Dryden the rest, Colley Cibber, wrote of Elizabeth Barry, in the art of exciting pity, she had a power beyond all the actresses I have yet seen. So I think I will end it there. That's the Restoration. We've looked at the political history. We've looked at the formation of the theater companies and then the theaters themselves. I've gone through three of the best playwrights, John Dryden, William Wycherley, Aphra Behn, and two of the most famous female actors, Nell Gwyn and Elizabeth Barry. So much more of the story to be told, but I will leave it there. And in my next and final video lecture, I'll be talking about the 18th century and see how the English stage evolved during that time period.